Well, I said I never had much use for them. Never said I didn't know how to use one. There's a movie line from Quigley Down Under that everybody ought to recognize, or at least a paraphrase of it. Today we're going to get back to that heavy-barreled Winchester 1876 project. Now I apologize, I meant to get back to it a lot sooner, but springtime on the ranch is a busy time of year, and that project's turned out to be a lot more involved than I originally expected when I took that gun apart. So today we're really going to get deep into that set trigger and see just exactly why that thing isn't working. And when I first took it apart, I didn't think it was going to be real complicated, but it's turned out that it is. So stick around if you're interested in Winchester set triggers. This will be a great episode for you. Okay, so here's the heart of the set trigger system. Here's of course the trigger itself with the little tiny adjusting screw that adjusts how light or heavy the trigger is when it's been set. We see the top of the sear over here, and then this is the part, or these two parts are really what dictate how heavy or light this trigger pull is in the set mode. This is the kickoff or knockoff, Winchester called them, and the catch hook here. And of course the screw here adjusts how far in this catch hook goes or how far out, and that's how it's adjusted. Now each of the sear, the knockoff, and the catch hook have their own spring inside this lower tang here, and we know that one spring's missing, one of them's in the wrong position. So here shortly we're going to get into that, and we're going to take all this apart and see if we can't make a little more sense out of this set trigger mechanism and figure out what's going on, why it's not working. So let's take a little closer look at these three set trigger springs. The one on the left here is the sear spring, and this one is the one that's on the bottom of the stack and on the facing the left hand side with the bow downward. And these have to be stacked in an exact order or they aren't going to work properly. Now next up is this knockoff spring, and this one's going to go second, and it's of course goes right in the middle. And then the last is this catch spring. Now this one's a homemade one that I made, so that's why it's a little shinier than the others, and it goes on top, and the bow is upward, just like the center knockoff spring has the bow going upward. So that's how they have to go in that lower tang to work properly. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take out this kickoff catch back here. Now that pin that holds it in has a shoulder in it to hold that catch over there on that side, so we have to drive it out from the right to left, which is a little different than most pins in a Winchester. Oh, she's going to come out easy. Okay, so it's kind of dropped over there and it's at an angle, so we're going to shove it over there and prop it up here a little bit so that we can get that pin driven out the rest of the way. Hopefully it isn't mushroomed any on the end there. Kind of acts like it might be, but we're making some progress here. Yeah, it's going. There we go. And it's just kind of crusty and corroded. I'm glad we went ahead and did this. So now we can pull it out. And this is the part this part of it right here rests on that little tiny adjusting screw. So that's what adjusts this in and out to limit our engagement or change our engagement to soften or make that set trigger a little heavier. Okay, so let's go to the next one. We'll take the trigger pin out, and that one holds a couple of other items as well. And of course, a set trigger gun has a little different type of trigger than a standard trigger. We'll see that when we get it out. Okay, so there, that's not too bad. Now here's the kickoff lever. And there's a sear in here that's on top of the trigger. And of course the sear is a little different design than a standard sear as well. A standard sear would be just full width across here instead of being cut in half here to accommodate this kickoff. And then the trigger should come out of there. They're a little more involved than a regular trigger on these things. Don't remember which way the easiest to come. Oh, there's another pin there that holds that trigger. We got to get it out of the way first. This pin doesn't actually, nothing actually rides on top of it, but it's kind of a limiter. And there it is. There, now the trigger come out, and we can see that little tiny adjusting screw. It's kind of unfortunate that it has to be so small to fit, because you sure see a lot of them that are broke off. Okay, we'll get those all cleaned up, and actually, let's get those springs out of there first. Let me kind of get repositioned here where you can maybe see how we get that. Actually, we'll just do it right there. Maybe you can see that all right. Maybe if I turn this a little bit. Now we're going to start it with this right-hand screwdriver. We'll get it in here. Actually, this way. We've got this end here, so it makes it a little easier. These 76, oh, it's coming out easy, thank goodness. So these 76s are a little more difficult because of the upper tang being in the way. But you can get them started with one of these type of screwdrivers. And then there's a small hole here for a tang peep sight. And if you take that plug out, you can reach in and finish unscrewing with a much narrower screwdriver. But I wouldn't try to break it loose with something this narrow, but it's kind of handy that they line up as well as they do. There we go. And take that out. And then these two springs should come out as well. Now there's our kickoff catch spring that should have been over on the other side like this. And our sear spring, which is kind of held down from all the gunk and whatnot in there. So it's a good thing we did take this apart. And there it comes. And there's our sear spring. And yeah, it's pretty gunked up. It's a good thing we got that apart. We'll get that all cleaned up and then come back and put it all back together. Now when I took this rifle apart, I was really focused on the set trigger parts to try to figure out why this set trigger wasn't working. And I was really happy when I saw that there was one of the springs missing, because I figured, well, surely it's just a real simple little problem and we can fix that right away. But I missed a really important part when I was taking it apart. I just gave a cursory look to the hammer and saw that it was missing the fly, and the notches looked like they were passable. I'd have to clean them up a little bit, but overall it probably was going to go right back in and work. So when I saw that I was missing the fly, and the fly is just this tiny little part that is called by Winchester the sear override, and it does exactly what it sounds like. It helps the sear to override the notches when we're in set trigger mode. So I got a hold of a guy that's been very helpful in the past on our Winchester Arms Collectors Association forum. Goes by 1873 man. And asked him about, what are the dimensions of the fly, because I didn't have one to go by. And so Bob, being the great guy that he is, puts together this drawing for me off of a set trigger fly that he had. I mean, isn't that great? Just wonderful information that he would take the time to do that for me. And then it wasn't good enough, so he took apart one of his 1873s. Now the 1873s and 76s have virtually the same set trigger mechanism. So he takes apart one of his 73s, but he's not really happy with that because it's got quite a bit of wear. So then he takes apart one of his pristine 73s that is basically unused, and you can see all the machine marks and everything still on it. This thing's hardly been used. Takes apart two of his 1873s just to get me pictures to show me exactly what I needed for that fly and how it sets in there. Now, one of the things I noticed with my hammer is that it looked like it took a shorter fly, and when I'm talking with Bob, he didn't really think so. So he went to another friend who's on the forum as well, goes by TR, and he takes apart this beautiful 76 Deluxe set trigger gun takes a picture for me as well. Now talk about going the extra mile. Oh, goodness gracious, these guys are taking apart these beautiful old rifles just to kind of help me out, to show me how it should look. Well, after looking at those and some help from these guys kind of troubleshooting, it became pretty obvious that the hammer I have has been pretty dramatically modified. Been ground down, filed down, the notches recut, and it's just not going to work in set trigger mode until it's repaired. Now this becomes a much more difficult project. The only way to repair it is to weld this thing up, build it up with weld, and recut these notches. And I have another problem now because I don't have a good set trigger hammer to use as a template to recut the notches. So I get a hold of a good friend of mine who's also a member of the association. He's a retired gunsmith, and to my thinking, probably the most knowledgeable Winchester gunsmith alive today. And lo and behold, a couple days later, here come not only a set trigger hammer for a template, but a pristine standard model hammer for an 1876 with the notches in really good condition to use as a template. Now the notches are in the same place, whether it's a set trigger or a standard. So having both of these as templates is just phenomenal. And he also included a fly so that I can use this for a template as well. And this one's just in pristine condition. So, you know, I talk a lot about the Winchester Arms Collectors Association and how valuable it is to become a member. You know, I'm not going to say that every problem you run into you're going to get this kind of help, but you know, if you're on the forum and asking questions and whatnot, you're going to have just about every question you ever had answered. You know, it's well worth the $50 to belong to the association, and you know, on top of that, the Winchester Collector magazine that we get quarterly is worth more than the $50 a year, in my opinion. So if you're on the fence, you know, what are you waiting for? Get off the fence, join up with the Winchester Arms Collectors Association. So now we've got these templates to use. Let's take a little closer look at what it's going to take, because this old hammer has been ground down a lot, and it's going to take quite a bit to get it back in shape. Well, hopefully you can see just how far this hammer has been ground down. Near as I can tell, in the deepest spot, I'm going to have to build it up about 200,000ths of an inch, which is an awful lot. Going to be quite a project. We'll have to go back then and mill off the excess weld and recut the notches, and then recut that recess that the fly resides in as well. You can see that kind of a recess right in here that fly sits in. So quite a project in front of us for getting this old hammer back into shape. Now, one of the things I really like to do if I have to work on the hammer and sear and the geometry of the two parts together is to build a little mock-up so that I can test it outside of the gun. Makes it so much easier because you have to do a lot of real delicate little work and then put the gun all back together again, try it, take it all apart, do a little more work if you don't have one of these. And this is really simple. It's just a trigger with the sear on the top and a hammer, two parts, and you just hold them, there's no spring pressure, and test them out. No problem. We drill 2 holes, turn a couple of pins and thread them, thread the holes, put it together. It's a 20-minute job to put one of these together. So the next step is we're going to try to put one together for an 1876 set trigger. But as you can imagine, where we've got just 2 simple little parts like this, think about what we've got to put together to make a set trigger gun work. Let's take a closer look at that. So here's this mock-up for doing work on a single action Army Colt revolver. Makes it real easy when we're doing a trigger job to see that we've got the creep out of the trigger. We can just pull that hammer forward and see how it goes. Make sure that it rocks back just a little bit so we've got positive engagement. See how it fits in the load notch and the safe notch, and nothing to it. We can just do it with 2 fingers because all there is a mainspring in this system. Now, if you can imagine trying to do the same thing with this pile of parts and all these springs. There's 4 springs here and pins and sears and kickoffs and catches and flies and oh my. So we're going to try to do this. Now this might be the most overly ambitious thing I've done in a while because the geometry has to be just perfect to make this work. So what I've done, I've got a piece of steel here and a lower tang for a 76, or what is going to become a lower tang for a 76 right here. And then over the top of it, after we get all this milled out, welded up together, drilled and tapped and all that, there's a piece of plexiglass here that is left over from a project on my excavator when I kicked out the kick panel on it. Had to make a new one. So we're going to really take on this project. It's going to make it so much easier if we can make this right, to be able to get this whole thing functioning outside the gun rather than put it back together and take it apart over and over and over again. You know, I just hate doing that, particularly on guns like this one with patina the way it is. It just becomes pretty obvious if you take it apart and put it back together repeatedly that it's been done to. So stick around. We'll get the milling machine fired up, the welder, the drill press. Geez, it's going to be quite a little process. And there we have the beginnings of a lower tang for an 1876 Winchester. Let's check it out. Still got a lot of finish work to do and a lot of holes to drill and whatnot, but we're getting there. Now this next step is absolutely critical. We've got this lower tang that we milled out earlier clamped up parallel to the original rifle tang. Now we've got to mark the placement of the pins and screw holes. So in order to do that, we've put layout fluid on the lower tang, the new one, and we found just the right size drill bits. We're going to put those through and just make a little mark in the layout fluid so that we can go over and drill these holes in exactly the right place. We don't want to get too rambunctious. We don't want to open up those pinholes any further than they already are. So we're just going to make a little mark so that we can get those centered. Now the geometry of this is absolutely critical. The set trigger mechanism is really delicate, and if the geometry is off at all, it's probably not going to work the way that I want it to. So this is a very critical step. Okay, we'll see how close we are now, and head over to the mill and put some holes in this thing. Okay, so we've got all the milling done, the holes drilled, and we're just finishing up tapping this last hole, putting threads in it, and we're almost to the moment of truth where we'll take this thing off the mill and go over and see if all these parts and pieces will fit in it. And the geometry is correct, which is the big thing. Okay, there it is. We'll clean up that last tapped hole and go over and see if we can get things put together and working the way it's supposed to. Okay, I've got this mock lower tang all milled and drilled and tapped, and we've got the parts and pieces in. You can see the 3 set trigger springs are in the bottom here. The set trigger assemblies, the pins are in. Now the big moment of truth. Did I get the geometry right, and will it set? Yep, there we go. She sets, and now you can see how that catch hook works on the knockoff here, and they're just barely catching with one another, kind of like this, or actually like this is the geometry of these. And that screw, of course, there's a little arm on that catch underneath here that the adjusting screw touches. So if we screw that in, then that's going to back that out a little bit, and that makes it a hair trigger. We screw that out, then it's going to move forward a little bit and going to get a little more engagement. So that's how that particular thing works. Now let's see how much it takes to fire. Not much at all, so that sets pretty well. So the next step for us here is to get this set up here. Of course the mainspring is going to set in here just like that, and then the hammer right in here. We're going to have to locate and drill and tap for the hammer screw here, and it'll set in here just like that. And then we're going to have to we're going to weld in some pieces to locate this lower tang in there permanently, and then we'll cover the whole thing with our little piece of plexiglass here, and hopefully we'll get everything set up just right and it'll work just the way it should, so that when we weld up this hammer and recut those notches, we can test it all outside of the gun and not be taking that gun apart and putting it back together over and over again. Okay, now after all this fabricating and welding and figuring and carrying on, we've got this contraption all set up. You can see we've got the mainspring in here, we've got the kickoff, or the catch here, the kickoff or knockoff here, the flies in place over here. So well, let's try it out and see if it sets. There we go, it works. Let's see just how hair trigger this one is before we start adjusting. Oh yeah, not much at all. In fact, that's probably a little too light. But anyway, now we've got this all mocked up, so when we get this other hammer worked on, built up, and all those notches recut and whatnot, we can test it in here instead of just having to put it back in the gun, try it over and over and over again. You know, because a lot of times it takes little minor adjustments here and there. This is real touchy, these set trigger mechanisms. So boy, this has been quite a little process putting this thing together, but the guys only got to do it once, and this will be sitting on the shelf for hopefully the rest of my life if another opportunity arises to work on a 76 set trigger. Now I really intended for this to be a two-part episode, but it's gotten involved enough that I thought this would make a good place to break and come back next time and weld up that hammer, get all the notches recut and whatnot, and everything back together, and hopefully we'll have that old girl shooting next time. So until next time, from me and the rest of the herd here at the Cinnabar, happy trails. How you doing, old buddy?